without any further ado, I'll just get into it. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk a little bit about the Best American Comics series, just to provide some context for anyone who isn't familiar with it and how it works and how we all ended up in this room here today. And then in order, I'll just ask each of our contributing artists to talk a little bit about the piece that's in the book, or the work in general that's in the book, and then about their work overall. And I have plenty of nice images by all of these talented artists here today to show too. One of the things that I like about anthologies in general is that even if there's work by one or several artists who one might see in the anthology and recognize and already have positive association with, an anthology is a kind of edited or curated collection of material and presents also an opportunity for discovery too. Since I would guess that probably everyone here knows the work of at least one of the artists on the panel and maybe doesn't know the work of at least one of the artists on the panel. So I hope that in kind of live action, the panel will function as a sort of introduction to the work of all of the artists here today. Okay, so my name is Bill Kartalopoulos. I'm the series editor for the Best American Comics series, which is an annual book published by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. This book is part of an overall series, or if you prefer, meta-series of series, a line of books that come out annually that all basically have Best American in the title. Best American Short Stories, Best American Essays, Best American Food Writing, Best American Mystery, and of course, Best American Comics. So these are all anthologies that come out annually. And this overall series of Best American titles, in one form or another, has been around for over 100 years. The first book that came out in the overall series was the Best Short Stories of 1915, which came to be called the Best American Short Stories. So that's was started over 100 years ago. Best American Comics started in 2006 with another series editor working on the project at that time. So in a way, one of the things that I like about even just thinking about that is that it sort of tells you something about the story of comics and its relationship to the world of literature and literary publishing. Certainly comics were around in 1915, but it took until 2006 for comics to be part of an overall series like this. And the way that these series work is interesting and a little complicated, and it was sort of alluded to in Nico's introduction, in that all of the series function in pretty much the same way, and that there's a series editor like me who works on the title over multiple volumes, working from year to year, but also collaborating each year with a special guest editor. So it's a kind of odd and interesting two-part editing process where each person has a kind of different set of responsibilities. Now, one of the things that's my responsibility is I receive submissions all year round. The Best American Comics, like all of the Best American titles, has an open submissions policy. There's a public address that literally anyone can send work to, as long as it meets the basic eligibility requirements, that it's a comic, it's North American, and it was published within a certain time frame that's matched up with that volume. And that is one of the really great things about Best American Comics, is that it really doesn't matter if a comic is a big, heavily promoted graphic novel from a big publisher, or if it's a 16-page photocopied, stapled, hand-folded zine or mini comic made by just any individual. As long as something has technically been published and it's a North American comic from within the time frame that we're considering, we will look at it and we will absolutely treat everything with equal seriousness. And in addition to receiving all of these many voluminous UPS boxes that I receive over the course of the year, of course, I also look around to make sure that we're getting the kind of stuff that we should be looking at, that I talk to publishers and self-publishing artists, I go to comics festivals, I talk to friends, I look on the internet, because there's a whole other world of comics online, and so on, to try and accumulate a pool of interesting comics every year. So I end up with a lot of comics in my apartment. So the next thing that I have to do is I have to read and look at them all and try and make a pre-selection of about 120 or so pieces. And that pre-selection of material then goes to our guest editor. So over the course of the period of time that I'm collaborating with the guest editor, I periodically send shipments of selections to the guest editor, usually 4 or 5 shipments, along with some digital materials that I might find online. So then the guest editor ends up with this pool of about 120 or so pieces, and they make the final determination about what's going to be in the book. And they also, of course, have the ability to bring in work that they might find on their own as long as it meets the eligibility requirements. So that's kind of how this odd two-step collaborative editing process works. So every year I'm working on the book, I'm kind of engaged in this cyclical activity of gathering up material and so on. But at the same time, every year I'm also collaborating with a totally different guest editor who's looking at a totally different pool of work. Even though we hope certainly from year to year that the series has consistently high level of quality, we also hope that every year it's different, and not just different because it's a different pool of material, but also different because you're getting another person's point of view on what the best comics of the year might be. Because certainly, I think one of the things one could say about a series like this is like, well, how can you say that anything is the best? It's all subjective, right? And I think having a guest editor who's different every time actually acknowledges that and makes a strength out of that subjectivity. Basically says, yes, of course, but what we're going to do is we're going to have a different person here every year making those subjective choices. So from my point of view, working on the book, I think it's successful if overall from year to year the level of quality is high, but if it feels different from year to year, the final book. So that, and I think it has, the volume that Phoebe Gloeckner put together, it feels different than the volume that Ben Ketchor put together last year, which felt to me very different as an anthology than the volume that Ross Chast had guest edited the year before and so on. So anyway, that's basically how the process works, and that's how the approximately 30 pieces that end up in the book make it there. I did just want to mention briefly the work of Phoebe Gloeckner, who Nico mentioned in the introduction as well, just in case anyone isn't familiar with Phoebe Gloeckner's work. She's someone who, in the 80s and into the 90s, published a number of short comics in a number of different venues like Weirdo magazine and Women's Comics and other places that were collected into a book called A Child's Life and Other Stories. And her next project, which is very interesting, was a book called The Diary of a Teenage Girl. This was a book that was based on her teenage diaries, and it's a very interesting combination of illustrated text and comics in one long book. And that book was adapted into a film not very long ago, I guess about 3 years ago, that was fairly well reviewed and good. Although I would say if you haven't read the book or seen the film, read the book first and then see the film, as we should probably always do. And she's currently involved in another long-term project where she's making a book about murders in Juarez, Mexico. And instead of drawing, she's kind of building dolls and sets and things like that. And she's released some kind of in-process versions of this material. So I don't know how long it'll be before this book comes out, but I have every confidence that when it does, it'll be one to watch out for. Okay, so that's enough of background. And I think at this point, I'd like to start talking to our panelists. Okay, so I'm just going to go alphabetically, which I think is the best way to keep the Julias and Julians straight in my head. So, Julia Gfrörer, Hi.
That's me.
The piece
Hello.
that is in Best American Comics is just a one-page comic that appeared. Is your mic on?
Hello?
Yes.
Yes, it is.
So this is just a one-page comic that's in that ran in an anthology called Black Eye #3. Can you describe kind of the general concept of this anthology as Ryan Stanfest, the editor, might have explained it to you?
This is my second piece that has been in the Black Eye series, and it's kind of a dark humor anthology.
Mm-hmm.
It's of all the anthologies that I've been in, this one, the pitch came with the longest like prospectus of
Mm-hmm.
like what does and does not belong in the book.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just like the grimmest, darkest things that still technically could be called humor.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And a lot of, I don't know, this piece I wasn't really planning for it to be funny, but it ended up being a little bit funny.
So can you describe, this piece is called Frail Nature. Could you describe what the kind of general situation is?
Yeah, so this is a young woman being tortured on the rack by I guess he's wearing a hat like a cardinal, but, and he has this little knife, and he undoes her bodice and then kind of becomes overcome with lust and flips out. And it was, you want me to just talk about the comic more, or did you want to ask me questions about it?
Oh, well, I mean, if you had something that you were about to say, please do.
Sure.
Yeah.
Of course. I guess this comic was partly inspired by a scene from Foucault's Pendulum by Umberto Eco, which is one of my favorite books, maybe my favorite book. So there's like a story within a story, like with any Eco book, where one of the main characters has written a novel that's kind of a pastiche of other things that he's been reading throughout the book. And there's a point in his story where his character is kind of, he's invited all these kind of Illuminati type figures to come and be a part of this secret society, and then when each one shows up, he murders them with his accomplice, whose name is Satoru Repo. This part is it's Richelieu.
Mm-hmm.
It's, and he shows up and he's like, oh, you can't do your black arts on me. And but what he does is he has this beautiful woman who Richelieu, who is an old man and has been lived a monastic life, is so astonished to see a beautiful naked woman that he essentially like dies.
Okay.
And it's funny, but it's also I don't know, I think it's very sexy. So I was thinking about that, and the comic also ends up dealing with kind of the like there's a kind of a MRA talking point that like actually it's the women who are in charge of everything because they control the access to all the sex, and they're keeping it from us to control us. And as a woman personally controlling the access to my body, I find that doesn't feel real powerful, as opposed to, say, being on the Supreme Court, I would say. So So that's what happens in the comic, is that this guy feels that he's being controlled by this woman that is obviously very powerless.
Right.
And she doesn't say anything in the comic, but you kind of see the, you don't see his face, and you see her face. So I guess you see his face at the beginning, but you know, I wanted to focus on like, how does this feel to her? Like, she's really not a part of this fantasy that is ostensibly about her.
Oh, that's a great, because there's so much, that's a great description, because there's so much, it's just one page, but there's a lot of embedded meaning in here, and there's a lot of ways that you could interpret it. Like you were saying, it has something to do with Foucault's pendulum, it has something to do with actual history, it has something to do, even, like you were saying, with, you know, contemporary, you know, if you, I mean, I don't want to, like,
I know. Well, I did
MRA
this comic in
politics,
2013,
yeah.
And it just happened to get published in an anthology last year, so it technically was published in 2017 or whatever. But it feels, you know, topical.
Yeah.
I'm glad I didn't do that on purpose.
Right. No, but I think one of the things, too, that is important about that is that you can see, this is just a great example of how effective even just like a single dense page of comics can be, that it can be almost like a short story or a poem or something and be kind of like rich with a lot of resonant meaning. And I think that's something that anthologies in general can also do, because right now comics are mainly getting to the world through the bookstore market. And that does tend to sort of privilege or bias long works, whereas a comic can be very dense and compact, especially when you're combining text and image, and the image itself can be very subtle and so forth. So you can pack a lot of meaning in there. And in fact, a lot of you know, historical comics that have been really interesting have been really short, like one-page comic strips or something like that. I wanted to just kind of also look at a couple of examples of some of your recent books. Your most recent book-length work was a book called Laid Waste. And I think I kind of get the impression that in a way it's a little bit like the piece we were just looking at, in that it's sort of grounded in your interest in history, but it's not specifically a historical story exactly.
Yeah, I mean, it's not, it's based partly on reading like people's memoirs of living through the bubonic plague, the multiple bubonic plagues. But it's not the story of any particular actual historical person. As you read this, I just want you to understand that this is the wide spot in the center is the middle of the page, so you gotta don't read it all the way across.
Sorry, this is a two-page spread, yeah.
So, yeah, it's historical and it's not. I try to do a lot of research, but at a certain point, it can be a distraction. And I, over my many years of being a cartoonist, I have tried to remove any like kind of unnecessary like cat waxing that I could be doing in the process, because the more time I spend on it, the more I will psych myself out and be like, oh, this is stupid. I should take this part out. This doesn't make sense. Like the initial like the crush that you get when you have an idea that you really like that can burn out. So for me, I have to make sure I get it all down before that happens. So at a certain point, I have to be like, okay, the research is done, and if this is not the kind of I don't know, ladle that they had in 14th century France, then that is too bad.
Right, and I get the impression that maybe I'm wrong, but like when you're talking about you sort of got the initial idea to do this came from reading what you described as accounts or memoirs of life during various bubonic plagues. But I get the impression that that starts out as just you're reading out of interest and you're not researching initially anyway.
I read stuff like that all the time. I really love to get as close to a primary source as I can, as close as I can to like a personal account. So if I'm reading about, like, I probably told you about this, like, last year I spent maybe a week or something reading the transcript of the Apollo 13 mission, which you can read the whole goddamn thing. It's on the internet. And a lot of it's very boring, but it's wonderful to sit through the boring parts and get to know the people who are in it. And then when there are like little moments of, I mean, this is what makes it fascinating, is that there are moments when you feel so close to these people that you know, are not close to, you have no connection with them. But that sense of communion that you can get sometimes is so magical, is so exciting to me. Anyway, so I read a lot for fun. I read, a lot of times because I read a little Latin and some Middle French, so I'll find like some old book that's like it's like in PDF in like a university library website, and I'm like, I've got like 4 dictionaries, and it's like 2 a.m. and I'm trying to figure out what it's about.
Is that your mirror piece is in that category, right? This is a piece that was in an anthology. These are just 2 images, 2 pages also from an anthology that you co-edited called Mirror Mirror 2. What is this source text originally?
This is just a book of like, it's not really medieval. It's from maybe like this early 17th century, I want to say. And it's a book of emblems, like family emblems from different noble families. And each one has a motto, which is in Latin. And then I think the original book didn't have this, but then like maybe a decade or 2 after, somebody else added this text kind of explaining the image, and sometimes not really explaining it, but just kind of like saying a anecdote that it reminded the writer of. So I picked out some of my favorites. I redrew them.
What language was that in?
It was in French. Okay. But like old French, like if you picture like reading something from like the 1600s, like that, but French.
Shakespearean French.
Yeah, exactly. But not in verse, which makes it easier.
One other image of yours that I've seen around a lot is something much more contemporary. You just recently designed the poster for the book tour of the very popular podcast Chapo Trap House.
Yeah, dude.
How did you come to do that?
I don't know. I know those guys a little bit socially, so, and I think that they first saw my artwork because I have I have like a threadless store that prints T-shirts on demand, and my friend Chris, who is their producer, was wearing one of the T-shirts, and they were like, "Oh, that's rad." So they kind of, I really wanted to draw the, the like cocaine CIA patch that they use sometimes, that is like, so there's this Grim Reaper, and there's like snow all around him, and he's got a hourglass, and I wanted to draw that, and so I just basically redrew that.
And you're currently working on a project that you had posted a sketch of the other day. Could you explain what that is? I guess this is your current project,
Oh,
right?
yeah, this is for the nib, and it should be finished next week. And it's I didn't write it. It's from an interview with a Doctors Without Borders doctor. And it's about rescuing refugees in the Mediterranean who, if they come from Africa, they go through Libya, and then a lot of times they're on these there's a ton of people crammed onto a not very seaworthy vessel. So most of this comic deals with this particular event where he, just as they came upon this one boat, it was kind of in the process of sinking, and then suddenly it completely sank, and then all the people that they were trying to rescue were in the water. Not all of them could swim. And they provided me with a ton of photos to work from and a little bit of video of this event, which was mind-blowing. Just because it was so chaotic and intense and incredible.
Yeah, and I guess this must be the first. You've done a lot of research-based work, but this feels like somehow in a different category because it's almost like documentary work.
Yeah, and it takes a little bit of that extra work off of me because they provided me with all of the. I mean, this is not drawn this is not a copy of a photo, but it's. The clothes, I think, are based on the clothes that one of the people in the photos was wearing and stuff like that.
Okay. All right. Well, that's something we can look forward to reading pretty soon.
Yeah, it'll be on the internet, I guess. On the nib, did I say that?
Yeah, the nib.
Okay, cool.
Okay, yes. Well, speaking of the internet, one of the comics that's published in the book is by Julian Glander, and this is a comic that I guess hadn't been in print before, right? This was only posted online?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is from a series called Susan Something that ran on Vice magazine, right?
Correct.
Okay, and so each of these is like a 12-panel comic strip featuring this character. And I think the first time I saw your work was when you had done another series maybe a year or so before called Please Look at Me. Were those the first comics that you made?
Yeah. I mean, I had drawn some comics when I was a little kid, but then, yeah, the Vice ones were the first ones I'd ever... I think the first thing I'd ever done was a fan comic of Blobby Boys, which they posted, and then that's how I got to do the ones on Vice.
Okay. And now all of these comics, I think I haven't seen very many people ever do what you're doing here, which is make fully digital comics that have this kind of 3D modeling kind of aesthetic. There are a lot of people who draw with on Wacom tablets, with brush tools and stuff like that. What? This is a super basic question, but what tools do you use to make a comic like this?
Okay, so yeah, first of all, I think it's it's kind of surprising to me there aren't more people doing this because it's really easy. One thing that I wanted to do with Susan Something was make it almost like a 3-camera sitcom or something, something where I wouldn't have to really think about what the models were going to look like, or I basically did all the models for the whole run of the series in a day. And then so the process is I kind of set it up I build a room with 2 walls and block everything out off of a script and just get the shots and always get 12 of them. I guess that's not a great answer.
That's okay. That's your process. That's how you conceptualize it, so that you're building just the things that you need, but that you're flexible enough that you can use them to make all the panels that you want. Yeah,
for this series especially, I wanted to be able to do them really fast, and I wanted it to feel kind of like playing with action figures or toys or something. Yeah.
And I guess around the time that I first saw your stuff on Vice, I think around the same time I noticed that you had also been doing like some GIFs that I was seeing around on the internet. I remember seeing this one a lot.
Oh yeah.
Which feels familiar probably to most of us. And this one as well was another one that I remember liking, that I saw it. Did you, maybe I'm wrong, but I'm kind of under the impression that like you didn't develop this style to make comics, but you found that it was something that was applicable to comics.
Yeah, I think to me, it's kind of applicable to anything. The first comics that I did, I really just wanted to like flex and like in the hope that it would like get me some more illustration work. Like the Please Look at Me comics, I just wanted to kind of show off like all the different things I could draw. So I would start with like, oh, I'm going to draw babies this week, and then I'd write a story about babies. Or oh, I'm going to draw a tennis court. Yeah, but the Cuppy. Yeah, I don't know. I really never thought I'd be doing comics. Like, I mean, even when I started, I kind of thought like I was 25. I was too far into my career, like too old to get started on it. Like, which is really stupid.
Did you think that you were? It's interesting to me that you were talking about doing illustration, because I feel like even just a few years ago, there weren't that many examples of people who were working in anything like your style who were doing like actual illustration. But you've done a fair bit. Like this is a piece that ran in the New Yorker. But were you doing like, or aiming at like animation or game design when you started working in this way, and then were also trying to make single images, or were you making single images first and then that led you to kind of put them in motion or think about interactivity or anything like that?
Yeah, I think I really wanted to be an illustrator, and I was doing like kind of bad, unoriginal like 2D work, and it just wasn't connecting with people because there was so much out there that already looked like that. And at the time that I started doing 3D modeling, I was doing a lot of different things. I was making music and doing short live action films with my friends, and just like posting everything that I was doing to Tumblr without like a strong kind of cohesive thing. And this is something that I think really took off because there wasn't a lot out there that looked like it at the time. So I would say I followed market forces.
Or at least audience feedback.
Yeah, same thing.
So, yeah. And I think the first time I remember seeing your work as just like illustration, although I'm sure it wasn't the first thing that you did, was this cover for the MIT Technology Review. Because I remember seeing it in a store, and it almost felt like this odd thing where it was like something from the internet was like suddenly in your house or something, just to see like it as a physical object in the store. And then when I was looking it up online, I realized you'd also done kind of like a GIF version of this as well. Do you think that's part of what you do as an illustrator, that because of the way you create this stuff, it can be in motion or it can be still?
Yeah, it's really, it's easy to turn a 3D model into animation. It's a lot easier than a 2D model, obviously. You don't have to draw extra frames and stuff. And like in the last 5 years in illustration, it's become like almost a standard thing now. When I first started doing it, there was no way that you would see a GIF in the New York Times or something, and now they have them every day.
Yeah, everybody wants to be on the internet, doing stuff on the internet, and doing the kind of thing that people want to share on the internet. One thing I wanted to ask you is, I guess one of the big differences between the other work that you're doing and the comics, of course, is you're writing a lot for these comics. Were you writing other kinds of things before you started doing the comics, or did you sort of have to like become a writer to make comics?
I actually went to school for creative writing, and I was writing like really, really bad like literary fiction for a while. It just fucking sucked. It was terrible. But that is my background.
Oh, okay. So this was a way to combine kind of what you had developed to be an illustrator with your background as a writer.
Well, I'm going to say something really corny.
Okay.
But to me, it's all about storytelling. Yeah.
Right. Well, no, but that's the basis of every like MFA and visual narrative program out there. It's
Big
just,
S word.
It's all part of storytelling. You've also, like, you're doing single images for illustration. I was looking on your site, and you also have like some images and GIFs that you just have labeled as like personal work. Like this is one that's just you have like an interior series. Can you talk a little bit about this series?
So this was something I started doing at the beginning of this year. I wanted to get into like I guess like plein air 3D modeling or like real world 3D modeling. Like I thought it'd be really cool to take my computer places and model the environment. So this one was a Airbnb I stayed at in the Catskills. I did a couple of my friends' apartments. And the hope was that like rich people would want me to come to their apartment and like sit there and 3D model their apartments. Yeah. But it's also like it's totally different to model your surroundings than to like work off of photo reference or to just work freely. So it was just like something I wanted to do to be a little fresh.
Okay, and this is another example from the series that's not a GIF. And this, so it's interesting because this one reminds me more of the Susan something style in the comics, whereas this one has this almost like GIF impressionism or something, where it seems like you're trying to capture like the light and the feeling of like dust particles in the air and that kind of thing. Is this a way of kind of getting away from this sort of very smooth surfaces and flat colors of a lot of 3D modeled work?
I don't know. I guess so. Yeah, I like the grain in this one a lot. But to me, they're not that different. I guess it's like, yeah, you're right. It's impressionistic a little bit. Like this is really like, this was the vibe when I was in this room. And then the other one that was like more pink and purple, like that was my old apartment in Bed-Stuy, and that's really more how I felt living there, I guess. And that pyramid with that's sitting on the couch is my friend Nikki, who's here.
Okay. And I guess, oh, right. And I guess you've done some longer animations. We've just been looking at GIFs. I don't have an example, but like I saw a piece that you did for a publication where it was kind of a longer animation about explaining how like blockchain
for
works.
MIT again.
Right. Have you worked on longer animations featuring like your characters and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I spent a lot of last year developing a TV series. And actually, Susan, that's originally how I had the idea for Susan, was that it was going to be a TV show. I wanted to do something like a web series or something where she was like this like live stream character, like a Twitch entertainer. And then like she'd play a different game every week, and then like we'd actually develop the games. And it was like, yeah, I ended up not doing that. It was too much work.
Were there one of the things about the comics is that they're very funny, and they work because they have like a really good sense of timing and visual, like in terms of the language and what's happening, but also like the visuals, like the slight changes in facial expressions or gestures or kind of moving the point of view in a little closer or out a little more. Do you have a background as a comics reader? Did you ever want to make comics, or was that something that just came naturally as a result of the big S storytelling?
Well, I read Understanding Comics.
Okay.
That's pretty much it, though.
Okay. So it just came from that, basically, just kind of the sense of pacing that maybe you would have thought of as being like a sitcom, like you were talking about before, like a 3-camera sitcom.
Yeah, I kind of think of it more filmically than comics. I think of it more like a little movie where the reader has to make the animation in their head. Yeah.
And you had mentioned that you were thinking that Susan something could be connected to game development, and you have posted. This is just a GIF, but you posted a really great teaser video for a game called Art School. All I've seen is the teaser video. So is it out yet, or is it?
No, it's going to be out next year.
And can you explain what it is?
So Art School is it's a video game for Mac and PC, and it's an art school simulation. The idea is you have this professor who's like a neural network, and he gives you assignments, and then you draw with this kind of like MS Paint apparatus, and then the artificial intelligence will grade your artwork and make you a better artist and make you more creative through gaming.
Okay. And are you still making comics, or is everything going into art school right now?
I'm pretty much done with art school, and then I have, I'm back to comics. I just wrote, I think it's the longest comic I've done. It's a 25-page Susan story, and it's gonna be. Actually, I don't think I'm allowed to talk about it, but it's gonna be out next year.
Okay, cool, great. Well, I'm looking forward to reading that. Okay, so I'd like to turn to Kevin Hooyman's work. Hi, Kevin.
Hi, hello.
You've done a lot of different kinds of things with your artwork. This is the second time your work has been in Best American Comics, and both times it was material from this series of like handmade mini comics you have called Conditions on the Ground.
Yeah, Conditions on the Ground was sort of an outlet I invented for myself to try to put comics out into the world. I print about 200 each of them, so it's pretty small distribution, and I tried to keep them on a monthly schedule, which meant that I couldn't really get stuck in like rethinking or rewriting or figuring out what went in or what didn't. It's a bit of a raw series that way, which was nice to just have a place where you could kind of dump everything and be a little bit free with ideas. I noticed even that I have some misspellings and things. Maybe not this one, but the next one.
Yeah.
It all comes out pretty quick, and it doesn't really get reworked. It just goes into print, and that's what you can do when you're printing, in your basement or whatever.
Right, right. And do you print these yourself on a risograph printer?
Yeah. I've had a Riso for, I don't know, maybe since like 2009. So
that's very early.
It's hanging in there.
Revolution.
It's always a bit of a struggle, but I'll try to print. Well, it's part of the fun, the printing process. I don't know if any people have worked with those machines, but there's a certain reward to just watching everything come off the press in a way.
Yeah, and you've done up to about I think maybe 20 issues of Conditions on the Ground?
22, and I've given it a little break just to work on other projects, and now I'm restarting again. So there'll be just because I missed that outlet, I did more sort of planned projects and longer stories, and even a story that was written by someone else, as one of the Julias was working on.
Yeah.
But this this format really just worked with my life. I could turn myself into a little comic making factory with this, between when writing came to me, when I felt like doing sort of a long detailed drawing that was sort of just a space out and draw opportunity, which is a habit I have. So in a way, it was just a place to make all my habits turn into a product. And these were the products.
And I remember the issues that I got from you. I think that the work came from, for this volume, I picked up from you at a comics festival in Brooklyn, a small press comics festival. And I hope I'm not misremembering this, but I think you told me that you had produced 10 issues over the course of the year, but not printed them. And then you printed them all at once or something? I
did that for the last 10, that was something that changed as I had kids enter my life, where that printing time, you sort of had to make a new space for it.
Right.
And once you get everything up and running, I've got a little folding machine, and you get your whole operation going.
Yeah.
And it takes a certain amount of space in New York, so you kind of convert your studio to a print workshop, and then I would just, I think for for the comics that appeared in this book, they were all printed in 1 month, even though they were written.
No, but I thought that was incredible because it showed that you even if because of having kids, you didn't have the time to print and fold everything, you still kept the discipline of making the book over the course of the whole year, and then you printed it when you had a chance to.
Well, there was a certain discipline to that. I mean, it was a little rule that I set for myself, which made me had to draw, and like I said, sort of took the burden off of deciding what was good and bad, and just you got to make something to fill this book to meet your own self-imposed deadline, I guess, which is a trick for all artists, figuring out how to make work, I think.
Yeah.
How to make it all happen if there's not someone, I don't know, telling you.
Yeah. you know, you talked about conditions on the ground as just kind of like a place to do things and just kind of get it out and not fuss over it. I'm wondering if do you have a sense yourself making it of like a kind of overall like subject matter about the kinds of things that are important to you that come out in this series?
I mean, I think ideally you're, and really, yeah, I think it's me. I mean, I think if you read the series, you probably get to know me to a certain extent, which again is sort of the art mission in a sense, to put yourself out there and find empathy and connect with people. And yeah, I think especially working in that looser format for myself, you're more likely to expose yourself in ways and really let yourself show through the comics. And I guess if I had to say there was a goal, I mean that's probably, or an overall message, a unifying theme. That's got to be it. They're basically autobiographical, and sometimes they're autobiographical in terms of describing a feeling, which would probably be the case for this. And then sometimes they're straight stories about something that happened to you in your life.
And one of the things too about the work is that I feel like a lot of it shows a lot of kind of sensitivity towards nature, or kind of like a lot of images of natural environments.
Yeah.
This is a spread that's in one of the issues that's also in the Best American Comics. And you, I mean, I guess the person who introduced you said you're from the Pacific Northwest, and you're living in Brooklyn now.
No,
right?
No.
Or I'm sorry, in where?
No, I'm in Brooklyn.
Yeah,
You're right. There's not, nature is not something like coming into my world every day.
Yeah.
It's a bit strange. I mean, this is sort of showing the juxtaposition, I guess, but I think nature's, I don't know why, it's just, I have no other way to explain it other than it's kind of fun for me to draw. Maybe it's kind of a tone like ringing in my head all the time to draw these sort of naturescapes. The one thing that they're not drawn from any specific natural world. They're always invented, you know, just inventing plants and inventing stuff. And there was something about that when I first started doing that was really important to me. It just seemed really cool to create your own landscape that couldn't really come from anywhere else, because you're not using reference. You're just using your ideas of what you think of as nature. And I think I still draw that way, and it's sort of it's the thing that comes easiest to me.
I remember, I think the very first time I saw your work was at a bookstore in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. I found at least one of your earlier self-published books.
Yes.
These were like, I guess, collections. I have them, but I haven't looked at them in a little while. But I remember them being kind of collections of comics and drawings and pages that were almost like collections of images.
Yeah, they were way less comic-y. I think at this point, I thought of myself as an artist who didn't quite fit into the art world.
Right. Well, I mean,
as a comic artist.
Yeah. Well, I remember too. Around that time, I think I also became aware. And you mentioned that with Conditions on the Ground, you're working very raw and direct and not getting fussy. But I remember around the time becoming aware that you were also making like very kind of detailed images like this one.
Yeah, that was a print I did. And again, that's just what happens with the like kind of late night drawing habit, I think. But yeah, I loved doing this. I mean, this was how I wanted to spend my time, and I think these prints I was able to sell. The books were, I mean, everything sort of took some time to find a place or what to do with the product I was making. But yeah, just I guess this was probably around like 2005 or something, and I think I was billing this as fine art, and it just was not. It was not popular, you could say, in the art world. People didn't like seeing writing on art at that little. Like there is a little comic bubble in there, and that I felt like that turned people off. I'm not sure what it was, but it was probably around 2008 where I sort of realized there was this whole world of alternative comics where people were going to shows and everybody's selling stuff on the internet, and it's all drawers. Well, not all drawers, I guess. I mean, there's everybody in it, but there were a lot of people who I identified with, just drawers and writers and people who wanted to say things but weren't necessarily into playing like the art game and doing that.
Yeah. And one of the things, of course, is, you know, this style of art is different from what's in Conditions on the Ground. And part of it, as you're saying, is because it's the self-imposed deadline and producing and not getting fussy. But some of it, of course, is the having to make work that you can reproduce as a zine, right?
Yeah, I mean, that last one was more a poster-sized thing. So, yeah, the conditions, the size I draw at, like this would be an 8.5 by 11 page folded in half. And I draw at size for Conditions. I don't shrink anything, so it kind of keeps it manageable. It's easy to whip out pages with those size restrictions. Yeah.
And I checked your Tumblr, and some of your more recent art that's not related to Conditions on the Ground. These are just a couple of things I just pulled sort of randomly. I just picked one that was in color and one that was black and white.
Sure.
Can you talk a little bit about what this work is?
Yeah, it's weird that the way I see myself in a way is just that I'm making work and then trying to figure out what to do with it. But Tumblr is my dumping ground for the work that's not comics. Just it's almost like sketch. I guess most people would consider it sketchbook stuff. I think, and I just put them up there. I think what Tumblr maybe is not as popular as it used to be. I'm not so in touch with social media, but it seems like, at least domestically, like the followers have dropped off. But it's kind of cool that people can repost it. Like there's people who don't really even make stuff. This is my sort of outside view of social media. I'm not terribly involved, but I like that because it just ends up in communities that it would never reach. And I kind of like seeing the community, like how people use it, how people put it on their feed, and what it fits into for them. Yeah.
And the other way your work has gotten out beyond the self-published zines is you had a book that came out about a year ago, I guess, of some of the Conditions on the Ground material.
Yeah, it was a pretty faithful reproduction of the first 10 issues. So yeah, that's available.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, Julia Jacquette. Hi.
Hi there.
I wanted to ask you about your work.
Certainly.
So this is a book called Playground of My Mind. And this is a book that I was very happy to find. And I think I learned that this book existed because there was a review of it on the arts website Hyperallergic, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Because this is the kind of thing I'm always really, just as an editor myself, happy to find, because it's something that I feel like formally fits within the purview of what I'm interested in, but it's not from the comics world necessarily. It comes from someplace outside. But then so that makes me feel like, oh, this is great, like it's a very expanded field. But on the other hand, of course, if I hadn't seen that review on Hyperallergic, for example, maybe I just wouldn't have flagged it, it's part of my process of looking for material, or maybe I would have found it like a year later or something like that, sitting on the shelf here at the Strand in the art section or something like that. But this is a really interesting project. This was a large, oversized book. We do include the dimensions of the books in our publishing information, because one of the issues with making a book like Best American Comics is that we're reprinting previously published work, and some of it was published really small, and some of it was published really big, and some of it only existed on the internet before, and so on. So sometimes we have to make formatting choices and things like that. And certainly the reader isn't seeing the work at the scale necessarily always that the work was intended. But nevertheless, how would you describe what this book is about?
Sure. So, tiny bit of background. I'm primarily a painter, and about 10 years ago, I was really compelled to make work about all these modernist playgrounds that had been in New York City. Some still are, some are gone. And I even played around with making tiny models of them, and then I realized the language that was going to talk about them and their importance to me the best would be comics. And although I hadn't made comics since I was a kid, I certainly was brought up in the language of comics, but I mean that in sort of an expanded way. Mad Magazine, the Eloise books, Tintin. Then I right away had sort of a clear idea of how I wanted to lay it out, that I wanted to work in gouache on paper. And also I was very adamant that these would be drawings that happen to be in the form of a book, so that the original drawings for the book would be exhibitable drawings. And that has happened, happily. So these pages are describing growing up in New York City in the 1970s and what New York was like at that time, and then how these architect-designed playgrounds were so influential in my aesthetics. And one of them happened to be designed by my father, and that playground is still in New York City. And then I talk about the affinity with playgrounds in Amsterdam, where I live in the summers. And those playgrounds, all designed by Aldo van Eyck, also were intended to be this area of play that was unstructured, not dictated to kids, didn't have recognizable forms, like there were no concrete elephants. There were these geometric shapes and geometric forms, encouraging kids to use their own creativity and play. And they, in fact, really did shape how I play and offered this system of structure that I could and other kids could insert our own ideas into. And I'm positing in the book that then became part of how I think in my artwork, like some kind of structure within, some kind of modular structure that you insert your own ideas and images into. And that actually is what comics are, in a way, that use of a modular way of thinking.
Yeah, it's basically just kind of an abstract form of, images in sequence, or text and image, or some combination of both of those things. And that's one of the things that I really value when someone from outside of the kind of self-constructed comics world makes a work like this one, is that you are doing things just formally in this book that are unconventional for comics, like, the way you kind of mix the text and image, you have, text running around images or moving in different directions. I mean, these are just a couple of basic examples based on these images here. But these are, because you're not kind of locked into a conventional way of making comics, because you're not steeped in that world, you suggest different things that people can do with the form by coming at it from an outside perspective. And I think
I'm so pleased to hear you say that.
That's why I always value finding things from outside the field, because I think at their best, when the works are successful, they suggest other ways of thinking about what comics can do. And this is an interesting kind of meditation on modernism and play, but it's also an autobiography too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And also a big thank you to New York City, and how in its real chaos, the wonderful, terrible 1970s, there was all this progressive thinking about architecture and playgrounds. They would never be built, currently. And everybody thought that now these modernist playgrounds would be regarded as dangerous. And in fact, my dad's playground, Discovery Play Park, which is on 100th Street in Central Park, it is still there, has been renovated, and I still think it's fantastic, but anything, any little wall that's higher than, I think it is 30 centimeters, has a railing on it, and all the sand was taken out, and they put the squishy stuff in it, and it's still wonderful. The basic design of it is so good, but you don't have that kind of literally brutalist playground. I mean that in the fondest way. A visual language that comes out of brutalist architecture. So that was one of them that I talk about. And also another one that's still there, which was the first adventure playground, is on about 70th, right north of Tavern on the Green in Central Park, by Richard Datner. And that's still there as well. Also has been rejigged, but still great.
I was looking a bit at your other work, because as you mentioned, you're principally a painter. And it's interesting to see how in some ways it's, obviously totally different from this work. But there are also some, I was kind of surprised too, that there were like some points of contact between your other work and this work as well. This is from a series called the Food Series, and maybe you can explain what this painting is. But one of the things, of course, that I noted was like, oh, there's kind of this visual combination of text and image, with the text running around the image and so forth. Could you explain what an image like this is?
Absolutely. So, in my 20s, I was struggling or searching to talk about desire and frustration and longing and yearning, and decided that food was this wonderful metaphor or analogy for that. But also I just thought a painting of food is the most appealing and the coolest thing, and it's a huge raised on pop art at the MoMA. So I'm thinking absolutely of comics, of signage, of charts, of graphic design, of cookbooks. And so instead of the text being strawberry tart or brownie a la mode, I'd insert my own writing to push that idea of sexual desire, romantic desire, just general desire and yearning. And actually, I've returned to working this way. After years of not using text in the painting, I've come back to it. So this is a recent one, which reads, "Your every word, a perfect jewel and knife in my own heart." And that's a painting about envy.
Are these images based on reference? Like that, I get, like they give me kind of like a mid-century,
absolutely,
like,
so
Good Housekeeping kind of vibe. Yeah.
I collected a lot of cookbooks from that era, and Life magazines, and then in later years still was using media images, but have gone to more contemporary media images, but then jumped back again, because I think for all of us, these mid-century images have become iconic. And they, even those of us who weren't born in the 50s yet, we respond to that kind of image.
Yeah. Yeah, and I have a couple of examples of some of these other reference-based images, including some that are contemporary and some that are historical. This is a painting from 2013, and one of the things that one of the other things that struck me as I was looking through your paintings that you have on your site is that not all, but some of them do use this kind of juxtaposition as well, where it seems like you're sort of creating a kind of grid of several images to resonate off of one another.
Absolutely. And that would be, as you've already pointed out, that's a parallel with comics.
And this is another one, I guess, is this an example of something that has a more recent kind of reference to it?
Yes, this is a let's see, 2014, and it's from contemporary fashion advertisements, or actually cosmetic advertisements. And the title is The Mouths of Four Gorgons. And so the specter of the perfect mouth and flawless face that hovers over us at all times has been a obsession and vexation of mine, and this is one of the recent pieces that deals with that. So it's Medusa and her sisters.
And actually, I only included this one just because when I was looking through the site, it reminded me of Julian's interiors. You have a series of a lot of interiors too. This was called the My Houses series.
And unfortunately, this bathroom isn't my bathroom.
Right.
In the aughts, in another attempt to quell longing, and I knew a lot of wealthy art dealers and collectors at the time who had homes all over the world, and I thought, I'm going to have homes all over the world. I just am going to make paintings of them, and that it's going to be my collection. So I have many, many bathrooms, all of them with chandeliers, and so that was a attempt to, well, I'll make the houses. They're all quotations, though, of shelter magazines that were super popular before the internet killed them, but at a certain time, I'm sure you remember, there were a gajillion home
Domus and Nest magazine and that genre of like interior decorating kind of pornography.
Exactly.
So these are also based on magazines. They're not based on the actual homes of like the collectors or gallerists you're talking about.
No, they were. I was pulling them out of home magazines. Although there is one that I made a color etching of this bedroom with a chandelier, and it was at a print fair, art fair somewhere, and this woman walked up to the booth and said, "Oh, that's my bedroom," and I actually eventually years later met her, and she and her husband were quite nice, and I actually went and went to go see it. That was the only time that happened, though. Maybe someday this person will see this painting up at the Tang Museum where it lives.
Now, you recently had a retrospective exhibit that opened in more than one location. This started at the Welland.
That is right. You have done your homework. So it started at the Welland Museum, which is on the campus of Hamilton College.
Okay, and that's the co-publisher, I should say, of the book as well, right? So,
bless their hearts, they not only made a show, they published Playground of My Mind and the monograph, which is called Unrequited and Acts of Play.
Right, that's this book. Yeah.
And
so this is
that's the monograph.
So this came out about the same time as Playgrounds of My Mind. So this is basically a retrospective, I guess, of painting, or is it just the recent body of work from closer to 2014?
Both. The show was both retrospective of painting and all the drawings for Playground of My Mind.
Okay.
And you can see how they hung it they made these special long frames for it.
And did you feel like the way that it was hung in the gallery, that it was sort of readable? Like if someone wanted to, they could sort of get the narrative of what you had written?
Absolutely. And the curator and the gallery designer collaborated on these special frames to do exactly that.
I see.
So that you really could feel like you were reading it, that the viewer felt like they were reading it as they wound around this U-shaped space. So it was perfect for it.
Yeah. And when you saw all of that work together in one big exhibit with the paintings and the work from the book, how did you feel that the sort of narrative memoir sat in relation to the other pieces, like the large, very large paintings and examples of things that we were just looking at?
Well, again, due to good exhibition design, the exhibition sort of explained that. This winding hallway with the graphic memoir that led into this bigger space.
I see.
And you can even see this meat painting right here, which has these, is one canvas, but also has these different panels and text on it. You saw that one right after you came out of that hall.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, so like kind of like the childhood memoir is sort of like the introduction to then get into the other body of work.
Yes.
Oh, that's interesting. Great. Okay, I think you're ready to open it up to questions from the audience. So I would invite anyone here who has any questions whatsoever of any of our panelists. If you want to ask me about the series, if you have a general question about comics and what's that all about anyway, feel free to ask away. We're here to answer any questions anyone may have. So who wants to ask the first question? We have a
We're pretty
microphone
tight on time.
Okay.
So we've got time for like 3 quick ones.
All right.
If anyone has them? Otherwise, they will be here signing, so
Anything?
no questions.
Okay.
Some
All right.
questions?
Here's one
Here
right
we go. Here we
Bob
go.
Sikoriak.
Yes.
Thank you.
This was great. I loved hearing from everyone. I had just a real technical question for Julian. So what program, can you give us any secrets about what program you use for?
All my secrets.
Okay, great.
I use this freeware modeling program called Blender. It's kind of like a bootleg of Cinema 4D, but if you go to blender.org, you can download it. It's really easy to start using. I think everyone should try it.
Cool. Sounds great.
Okay. Anyone else?
I can ask the last one, unless someone else was here. No?
Go for
What are
it.
you all working on? Like, what's your next thing?
I'll say, so I am making little still lives out of figurines and plastic vomit to express the feeling I have about our current state of affairs. And with also some cutouts. So some of the figures are flat and some are three-dimensional. And I feel... and are all different stylistically. So it connects to, I think, my childhood and Mad Magazine, and but they're paintings. So just keep an eye out, everybody.
Go down the line. I'm working, just cranking away on my Conditions on the Ground series and doing, I don't know if people know the Latvian books, the Kus. Is it Kus Comics? Am I saying this right? Kush? Doing a little Kush book.
Oh, okay, like a Kush mini.
A mini Kush, yeah. But I think it's like maybe 30 pages. I forget how long. But they're mini and they're short and they're kind of fun. They should be checked out.
Great.
In addition to my video game and my book, I'm making these musical instruments. Like I collect a lot of old toy keyboards and stuff, and so I wanted to manufacture my own. They're these like blobby pink and purple pastel keyboards and drum pads and stuff. And those are getting whipped up in a factory right now. That's my big thing.
You saw the comic that I was working on for the Nib. I don't like to talk about things that I'm working on before they are finished because I feel like it jinxes it.
I don't like to either. You don't have to answer it.
Yeah,
Totally understand.
I'm working on collecting all the celestial weapons in Final Fantasy X.
Awesome.
That's my current project.
Okay. All right. Oh, Sonica, do you want to ask a question? Okay, we have one more.
My question is to all of you. How do you feel about graphic novels that have a lot of text in them? Or do you think that a lot of text makes graphic novels and comics inaccessible? Or do you think that you would read them?
I have a strong opinion about that. I think that comics is a separate language from prose. And they're related, but being able to do one is not the same as being able to do the other. And people who are mostly writers, fiction writers, journalists, they want to pack a lot of words into their comics because that's how they express themselves. So they'll be like, you know, okay, here in this panel, the guy is going to be like, oh, help, the leash broke and I lost my dog and he ran away. And then you're going to draw a picture of him holding a broken leash while his dog runs away. And that's not good comics. You can have one or the other, but the picture needs to be doing something different and really needs to be doing more of the heavy lifting. You may have heard the adage, so I won't say it, but the picture can pull a lot more weight than the words can. So you can make a very wordy comic, but I would say that at that point you have to ask yourself why you want to make it a comic, because it doesn't have to be a comic.
Actually, I don't have a strong opinion either way, so I didn't need to pick up the mic.
I could pass as well on that. I mean, there's all sorts of successful comics. Some can be texty, some not texty. I don't know.
I would completely agree. And as a painting teacher, where I'm always trying to say whatever works. There are no rules. The wordiest comic could work, the least wordy could work, and I guess I would say Phoebe Gloeckner, who broke all the rules with a book that's comic and illustration and pages and pages of text. I mean, that Diary of a Teenage Girl is amazing. So there you go. I would, if you described it to me, I wouldn't have believed it could work, but it does. So yeah, isn't that a pain in the butt, though?
All right, please join me in thanking our panelists for being here today.